Welcome to the next installment in my video lecture series in economics. And in this particular video lecture, I'm going to be taking a look at freight cost and the manufacturing bid rent curve. And this video lecture is very much for my urban economics course, in particular Chapter 6, Figure 6.1. And in particular, what we want to take a look at is how the distance from a highway, for example, if you're shipping things interstate via trucking, and how that relates to the shape, the amount of rent or the bid rent that you're willing to pay. So what we'll take a look at, let's say the further you get from the highway, the interstate highway, how much that impacts your bid rent. Please note that you could substitute anything in here for highway. I don't say anything, but for example, we're using an example where you're shipping via trucking, so you need access to the highway system in order to do that, for example, to sell throughout the United States. Alternately, you could be the distance from a port. For example, if you're shipping things overseas and you're going to ship them via container ships. So it would be important to know the distance from that particular port and how that impacts the bid rent. Alternately, if you're going to be sending these things via plane, if you're shipping via air, you could put in here distance from the airport, for example. So we want to take a look at is how this distance from that transportation hub, whether it's the highway, a port, or an airport, impacts the bid rent. So for example, if you're right on top of the highway, you're going to be willing to pay a very high rent because your transportation costs are going to be lower because you are located right by that interstate highway that you need to get to. But the further you get away from that interstate highway, for example, let's say 5 miles away, you see that the bid rent decreases because you're incurring additional transportation costs. So we can move even further away, let's say 10 miles, your bid rent would decrease, and the example here we have is $250. We can go another 5 miles to 15 miles, and the bid rent would be $200 per hectare. We could move even further away, 20 miles away, the bid rent falls to $150. And if we move to the point where we're 25 miles away, we would only be willing to pay $100 per hectare because of the additional transportation costs associated with getting to that transportation hub that we're using. As I said previously, you could think of this if you're shipping things on roads, you would want to be close to an interstate highway in order to transport your goods throughout the United States. We could also put this, for example, how far away you are from a port. If you're shipping things via container ship, either overseas or down the coast of the United States, or shipping it through the Panama Canal over to California, etc. That distance you are from the port is going to have you incur higher transportation costs, and in order to compensate yourself for those higher transportation costs, you're willing to pay a lower rent. Same thing we can say for an airport. If you're shipping things via air, the further you are from the airport, the greater your transportation costs, therefore the lower the rent that you're willing to pay. So make sure you realize that there's going to be a downward sloping bid rent curve when we're talking about distance from a highway, distance from a shipping port, distance from an airport, due to the fact that the further away you get from that transportation hub, the greater your transportation costs, and because of those higher transportation costs, you are going to want to have lower rents associated with that building because of the fact that you, for example, let's say you were looking at two different facilities, identical facilities. One was 25 miles away from the airport or the port or the highway, and the other was only 5. You would want to pay a lower rent to reflect the fact that you have higher transportation costs the further away you are from that transportation hub.